Hello, everyone. I'm Matthew Goldberg from the Cebu Board of Governors and Consumer Banking Reporter at Bankrate. On behalf of Cebu, welcome to today's webinar on covering inflation. We have a great moderator and panel here today. Our moderator is Mark Hamrick, Washington Bureau Chief at Bankrate. Joining us on the panel today are Jeff Hill, Associate Commissioner at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Jonnelle Marte, economics reporter at Bloomberg News, and Dion Rabouin, reporter at the Wall Street Journal. If you have any questions for the panel, please put them in the Zoom chat and those will get to Mark, and Mark will get those out to the panel. Feel free to hashtag Cebu on Twitter, and additional information about our speakers is available at cebu.org. With that, I'll hand it over to former Cebu President Mark Hamrick. Mark.
Thanks so much, Matt. Good to see everybody. And I know we've had just a great response to the registration request. So thank you for joining us all across the land. And we do want to get to your questions as we proceed, but we have plenty to deal with right at the top. And, you know, it's been no secret that the annual inflation rate in May was more than 8%, 8.6%, the hottest since 1981. But according to the Pew Research Center, the U.S. was hardly the only place where people have been experiencing this. In fact, in nearly all of the 44 advanced economies analyzed, Pew found that consumer prices have risen substantially since the pre-pandemic period. And in 37 of those nations, the average inflation rate in the first quarter of this year was at least twice what it was in the first quarter of 2020. So it's been a crazy news cycle, and the last week or so have been perhaps as much so as we've experienced between that hot CPI read and the Federal Reserve's rapid reaction and shifting from what was thought to have been a 50 basis point rate increase to signaling they're going to do 75, and then indeed following through with that. I'm really happy to have the tremendous panelists that we have here today. So you're going to have an opportunity to ask them questions, and we'll start at the very top with Jeffrey Hill from the BLS. I have some questions for you, Jeff, but I know you also kindly put together some preparatory materials for us. So rather than dive right in with my questions, why don't you just take it from the top there, and thank you.
Okay, great. I think go to the beginning of the slides here. Yep, perfect. I'm going to give, next slide. Great. I'm just going to give everyone a minute to read this. This is something that Chairman Powell said last week. I agree. I think most people don't pay much more attention to inflation than sort of the headline numbers, because that's really what they're experiencing. But you know, if that's all that your audience cares about, that's pretty easy to write about. But I do think there are going to be folks in your audience who want to know a little bit more. They want to go a little bit more in depth or look at things from a different perspective. And what I'd like to do today is give you some ideas about how you do that. If we can go to the next slide. You know, on our press release day, on a data release day, we issue press releases. And again, this kind of tells you all the high level stuff. It talks about the headline number and what people call the core number. And then it explains a little bit more about the subcategories that are moving things. Next slide, please. But, you know, actually, we break down our indexes into a tremendous detail. So whereas all items on this chart here shows is the headline number, you can see it gets broken down into food and so on. And so this is where you need to go to find the really interesting data that can make a great story. Next slide, please. So Mark just talked about the May inflation rate compared to a year ago, up to 8.6%. Well, where does that 8.6% come from? So we have food, energy, and all items less food and energy, which is what the media calls core. And you can see clearly gasoline, rent, and owner's equivalent rent are really what has moved things tremendously over the last 12 months, along with food at home and food away from home. There are some very interesting, I think, stories there. I looked at medical care over further on the right, not up maybe as much as some people would have thought. Why? Again, some great material for interesting stories. If we go to the next slide, please. This is just a little visual showing you data across the country, because we do have some regional data. And you can see where inflation's a little hotter, where it's not quite as hot. Again, possibilities here for very interesting stories, I think. Next slide. It isn't just about the CPI, though. We have other inflation measures that I think are really important, including the producer price index, the import price index, and the export price index. And you can see they also have been experiencing these tremendous price increases over the last few years. And on the next slide, this just graphically shows you, going back December of 2016, we were kind of moving along at that nice Federal Reserve preferred 2% rate. And then the pandemic came, and the price indexes across the board here all declined. And then post-pandemic, they've been going up and then going up dramatically, especially more recently. Next slide, please. And the same thing is true of core. The definitions of core are a little bit different for the different index series, but again, you see that same trend. And so when people are talking about the persistence of inflation or it being temporary, this kind of gets at some of the underpinnings. And next slide. One thing I really like to look at is what's happening on the business end, what's happening with business-to-business sales. And we see that through the intermediate demand producer price index series, which is plotted here in red for processed goods, green for unprocessed, yellow for services. We also look at the import price index for goods. You can see that those are all increasing. I also plotted on here the employment cost index that we produce. That's a quarterly number. It's the black dots, and we put a line there to make it linear. You can see how that has been increasing over time. If we want to know what's going to happen with consumer inflation, we have to look at the business side too, because businesses are experiencing inflation and they're passing those costs on to consumers. Next slide, please. Again, on this slide, I've got the consumer price index in blue, that ECI, the black dots. It's the same graph from the other slide, just taken a little bit differently. And here we added on in green, average hourly earnings. We can see that they've been increasing, but the red line shows real average hourly earnings, which means that it's adjusted for inflation. You can see that's been really flat since December of 2016. Went up a little bit, and actually it's been going down a little bit lately. What does that mean for consumers? Next slide, please. Then within our inflation measures for the CPI, we have some different versions, things that we do for different purposes. The CPIU for all urban consumers is the headline index that you always see on the news. But what about the W? People only talk about the W because that's used for Social Security cost of living adjustments. So people tend to talk about that in the fall. Actually, if you would click for me, please, I'm sorry. You can see that these are all running at different rates. And so, one of the stories I'm starting to see a lot of talk about is how great the COLA for Social Security might be this fall, because it's running hotter than the regular CPIU. And then we have some other research measures as well, including one for folks 62 and over. And a lot of folks think that maybe that one should be used for the Social Security adjustments. Next slide. And a lot of the difference in these different indexes, the different ways we look at the CPI are based on spending weights. You can see how important, for instance, shelter is in the whole composition of the CPI. Motor fuels are actually a small component, but because they are so volatile, they tend to move the overall CPI a lot more than other components do. So again, really interesting stories here to look at. Next slide, please. And then I just want to talk about our consumer expenditure surveys. This is an annual survey that we put out. With this, it is usually a little bit lagged. So this shows the change from 2019 to 2020 when the pandemic hit. And you can see that for all consumer units, average annual expenditures were down 2.7%, while income before taxes was actually up. And one of the curious things is what's going to happen in 2021. So we only have the first half of 2021 data available. And if we look at the next slide, please, you will see that, in comparison to the previous year, the first quarter and second quarter of 2021, spending was way up. And so clearly, that has had an impact on consumer demand and on inflation for the economy. So again, lots of rich data here. It's just a question of mining it, finding the interesting pieces and using it for stories. And so with that, I think the next slide just points out some web pages where you can get this kind of information and some phone numbers you can call as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. I know you've been with BLS for a number of years now. I guess you started your current position in 2020. I just want to ask you, as someone myself who has been amazed, but appropriately so, at how inflation has sort of almost become more important than the employment data that would tend to sort of be most commanding in the news cycle. When did you start to notice that inflation began to behave much differently than many people experienced over the past decade and beyond?
I would say that I sort of really started noticing it at the end of end of 2020, early 21, as that earlier chart showed, where it was really starting to take off. And also looking at kind of what was happening with consumer spending, I thought, this is not really boding well. I mean, I don't think it's just the effects of us coming off the pandemic. I think we really have a problem here. And, I was always very cautious about terms like transitory, and now I'm a little cautious about terms like peaking, because, we don't forecast at the Bureau, but I personally am still a little bit concerned about what we have yet to experience.
Well, we want to explore that a little bit further. Let me just throw it open to our other two panelists. Jonnelle, any opening comments for you or reactions, anything Jeff had to say?
Sure. So I figured I wanted to talk a little bit about what it's like in my job as a Federal Reserve reporter to cover inflation, because it's definitely the topic of the moment. And, we, in our role covering the Fed, we look at it in terms of how it's likely to affect policy. So, you mentioned that how fascinating it was to see the Fed really shift its decision at seemingly the last minute there to and in reaction to fresh inflation data, right? So once they saw that inflation was not coming down and that inflation expectations could be rising, they made the call to make a much more aggressive rate increase. So, as a reporter, I'm watching it for intel in terms of how it might affect policy. We try to think like the policymakers. And then we also look at how it affects the people, right? Because those are our readers, that we have our own personal experiences with inflation. And we want to explain, what it's like in real life on the ground. And so that presentation from Jeff was really helpful, because it's some of the same stuff that we look at, that the Fed officials are looking at, and really rich resources there that you can mine to get those stories that look at not just, again, what it might mean for rates, but what it is costing more right now. And we also look at food, rent, and other costs like that, as Powell mentioned, they might not necessarily be things within the Fed's control, but it's still, there are still things that people feel in their everyday lives, and that could make the Fed's job more difficult. Because if people start to believe that inflation is here to stay, then it could affect how they behave, what they spend their money on, and how, what happens to prices down the line. So inflation and inflation expectations are also really important to keep an eye on. And we report on those figures. So inflation expectations, we get surveys that are done by the Federal Reserve. For example, I'm in New York, so the New York Fed has its monthly survey of consumer expectations. And that's something that every month we get to see how consumers expect prices to be in 1 year or in 3 years. And now they've also started doing the 5-year outlook. So really, for policymakers, they really want to see that those longer term expectations are anchored even if people know that prices are going up in the near term. So we report on that too. And we try to find stories about people, again, how they're coping with this. It's one of my colleagues recently looked at, well, first, take a step back. It's good to look when you can in terms of where things are the highest or where things are the lowest. And so one of my colleagues recently did a great story out of Midland, Texas, where inflation was the highest according to some data from Moody's Analytics, and really great stories there from workers, business owners. What is it like right now to manage higher prices, even though the unemployment rate there is really low? So you could see the tension. Those are sort of the kinds of stories that we try to tell in our reporting.
Great, thank you. Dion, I know you've got something you wanted to share, but also just your sort of opening comments and overall reaction, please.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Tessia's got that chart up. I also want to say I really appreciate Jeff stepping in and saying, he's been cautious about terms like transitory and terms like peaked. And I don't know that enough of us in the media were properly skeptical or properly cautious about use of those terms heading into this most recent CPI report, and also, in 2021, following, when the Fed first started using that term. I really felt like there wasn't a lot of pushback, and I'm really glad to hear Jeff say that. So I just want to talk about perceptions of inflation and how we in the media can talk about those perceptions of inflation and the way people are really thinking about it. One thing that actually someone asked me recently that kind of caught me off guard, but actually the more I had that conversation, I realized it was a really good question. Someone asked me just like, what is inflation? Right? Like they understood inflation means prices go up, but like what actually is it? And, it literally is just that prices are being inflated or rising, and the pace of those increases is increasing. And I wanted to show this chart here just because this survey is a bit flawed. I don't love the methodology of it. It seems like they let people sort of pick a number of different options, but you can see, like almost everything in data, this one is influenced by people's politics. And I'm sure had this survey been taken in 2018 or 2019, the percentage of people blaming the president or crediting the president for inflation would probably be in reverse between Democrats and Republicans. But I think it's also interesting the percentage of people who talk about the Federal Reserve, Congress, large corporations, international financial institutions, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we get caught up a lot of times when we're writing these stories in kind of giving simple explanations for what's happened rather than diving into that nuance, or at least even acknowledging the nuance. And what I think is really interesting is that inflation is influenced by a lot of these different parties, but none of them, I would say, necessarily have a lot of control over it. So starting with the president, just wanted to get into that a little bit. The president obviously signs legislation, he pushes legislation, and can back things like the American Rescue Plan or the CARES Act, but control, I think, is sort of a different measure. It is, though, I think, important to acknowledge that inflation largely is this idea of too much money chasing too few goods. And so when you're pumping a bunch of money out, it's a very simplistic explanation to say, okay, well, the American Rescue Plan was $1.85 trillion added to the budget deficit. But you have to remember that's after $900 billion from the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which passed in December, $2.3 trillion from the CARES Act, which passed in March of 2020. So the president does play a part and play a role in that. I think, we sort of get caught up in this back and forth of, is it Joe Biden's fault or is it not? Joe Biden certainly plays a role. Donald Trump certainly played a role, but it's not simply an idea of one person. Also, Congress passed both of those bills, which were turned into laws and pushed a bunch of money out into the economy. So certainly fair to talk about that. The other way the president plays a large role in inflation is just the president nominates the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Fed Chair Jerome Powell was nominated by President Trump. He was renominated by Joe Biden. So his actions are both reflective of both of those people. Obviously, the Federal Reserve raises and lowers interest rates, keeping interest rates at that 0% level over the past 2 years and starting to raise them earlier this year. Milton Friedman would say inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And again, this is where, we don't know for sure. We aren't entirely sure, because if you look back at the history of quantitative easing, which the Federal Reserve had been doing for years leading up to this inflationary spike, there really wasn't a big push in inflation. And actually heading into 2020, there was a big push by the Fed to get inflation higher because it had been so low for a long time. So I just think it's important to keep all those things in mind when we're talking about inflation and when we're explaining inflation, what's going on and why. I did an entire video on how large corporations increase and influence inflation. Essentially, as prices start to rise, when you look through earnings reports, you can see these things called profit. You can look at these companies' profit margins and their earnings reports, and you can see how much they're raising prices by. A lot of them on their earnings calls will even talk about, we are pricing to go along with inflation, but their margins show that they're raising prices by about 20% more than the wholesale or producer price index would show that inflation is. So they're raising their prices by more than what they're paying. And so they're not keeping up with inflation, they're actually leading inflation. So they play a role as well. And then finally, I don't think there's enough emphasis on the fact that inflation also is partially controlled or elevated by just regular people, by people continuing to buy the things that they're buying, even as prices go up, by people demanding higher wage increases. So it comes back to everyone as individuals. And I think a lot of those things kind of get lost when we talk about inflation. So just wanted to show that off and talk through that a little bit, and excited to get into the rest of the panel.
Great. Thanks to everybody. I think about the fact that we are not where we want to be as a society in terms of either civic or financial literacy. And so the misunderstandings that occur about this, that in some ways are represented in that chart there, are an opportunity for us to try to better educate ultimately the citizenry and our audiences. Whether people are compelled to learn those lessons or not is another question. Let me go to both of our journalists here. But before we do that, I want to thank the two people who have entered in their questions in the Zoom chat. One question from Aaron is mentioning the fact that there are a lot of references to historically high inflation. We did that at the top, references to both the 70s during the whip inflation now era under President Ford, and then in the 80s again. What is the best period to try to compare the current experience? Jeff, do you have a sense about that?
Right now, it's really comparable to the early 80s. So I just pulled some numbers here. So the May CPI headline was the highest since the period ending in December of 1981. Core is slightly down. So really the highest for CPI core was in March, this past March, so not that long ago. It's only down a little bit since then. And that was the highest since August 82. PPI, it had records also in March. So, and the data doesn't go quite back as far, but it's comparable again to the early 80s.
And you can find all that data at your website, right? The historical data may not show up advertised in the news release per se, but it's all there for people to draw upon. And then Kate asks, along with the 12-month inflation rate accessible by region, what other regional breakdowns are available in whatever data set that might be relevant?
So if you remember that first diagram I showed you with all items and then food is broken down to cereals and other things. We don't have it at quite that fine level by regions, but we do have things like food, automobile, some of the really big groups broken out by region. And so again, that's all on the BLS website where you can go and look at that.
Thank you. One of the things I loved and continue to love, I'm thinking about a specific instance recently, but I saw a great treatment that my colleague Sarah Foster at Bankrate pointed out to me in the Wall Street Journal was the rising cost of haircuts. And I thought that was a great breakdown. But for our journalist friends, you know, it's one thing to report on the data, and I know depending on which enterprise or outlet one is working for, you know, you can maybe just throw the data out and you don't have to personalize it or sort of tell the, you know, here's the example of this trend as personified in an individual. But how do we best go about finding those people and trying to find the examples that you know, that can be sort of the lead of the story, whether it's a soundbite in video or a podcast or audio, radio, or in that sort of first graph of the story that talks about, you know, the person didn't want to pass the higher price of doing business along to their haircut customers. And either of you want to take that?
Well, I'll just say that I think that's one of the most important parts of the story, because sometimes something is really clear in the data, but if you cannot drive it home to people with the example of somebody that they might relate to, it can make the story a lot less, I guess, readable or have a little bit less impact. So it's really important. It's also one of the most challenging parts of the reporting, because, like, you know, really enjoy spreadsheets and I love talking to people, but finding the right person is hard. So, you know, avenues that I turn to, so you'd be surprised, a lot of people will comment about these things on social media, especially probably gas prices, right? So you try to see what people are commenting on. There are a bunch of groups sometimes on Facebook where if you're trying to target a particular workforce, you might find groups where people in that industry or in that job get together to vent or talk to each other and see what they're talking about, and, you know, with permission, reach out to different people who you think might be relevant to your story. And then, of course, just getting outside. And if you're writing about rising food prices, going maybe to like a food bank or wherever, you know, supermarket, wherever you think you might be, traveling to the places where, as I mentioned earlier, on the list, they're the highest or the lowest, or someplace you think you want to focus on, and just going there and talking to business owners, knocking on doors, finding businesses online and just calling them. There's a lot of different ways, but it is really important.
Dion?
Yeah, I was actually taking notes there because Jonnelle's stories are always full of very interesting characters. And I'm always like, yo, where'd she find these people? I've seen her throw some things out on Facebook as well. So I know that's one thing I use, is just kind of tapping into my network. And, you know, if it's not someone I know, which, you know, I usually try to avoid because that's a little too close, but someone I know, someone they know, you know, a person who, you know, their aunt or they have a friend from another state or something like that. The other way that I've found is, especially with trying to find, you know, folks like small business owners to talk to, is tapping into just local groups, whether that's in your, you know, in your regional area. Like I'm here in Denver. There's a, you know, Chamber of Commerce here. There's different other business groups that are, you know, focused on helping each other out and, you know, getting the news around. And so you can kind of tap into those. And I think for individuals as well, it's interesting. You can just find regular folks by kind of searching through different groups. Facebook has been a really great resource for that because a lot of people, there's just kind of a group for everything. So I know, and Jonnelle already said it, but just getting outside, talking to people, going to the barber shop, and just, you know, look for someone who's like, damn, $35. You know, that person is, you know, going to make a great character for the story. So I think that's really the key, is just tapping into every resource you have and not being stuck in the office on the phone. When you're looking for real people to tell the story about what's really happening, you've got to go out there. And especially now that I live in real America again, it's been good to just kind of like get out and find people and talk to them and ask, hey, what's going on? What are you thinking? How are you feeling? Why? And a lot of times that'll even spark a story.
Where's real?
Real America is the middle and the flyover states, if you will.
So you're living in all those states.
I live in every single one of them. Yes.
That's very impressive.
Yeah, my Wall Street Journal salary allows me to own a home in every state in the middle of the country.
Okay, very good. Well, I, grew up in Kansas, and one of my friends who has worked in both DC and Kansas says we all live in a bubble, wherever it is we're living. It's a different kind of bubble, and that's not necessarily an inflated bubble, but one that's encircles us. One question from Murray here. This might be for you, Jeff. We know that the Fed, at least until this period, tended to look at the PCE, which is another measure of inflation. And the question for Murray is the CPI accurate for current buying patterns, and do the thousands of items checked reflect perhaps recent pattern changes in consumption where many people, for example, are working from home, et cetera?
That is definitely one of the differences between the PCE and the CPI. There are others. The CPI is a little bit lagged on its market basket of goods because the Bureau's Consumer Expenditure Survey, where I showed you some of the percent changes earlier, that's a little bit lagged as well. So we usually have about a 1 to 2 year lag, which we are starting next year going to shorten to just be a 1 year lag. So that's really exciting. But yeah, that's definitely something to consider with that.
So you talked a little bit about, you talked a lot about the composition of the CPI. And one of the things that's had a fair amount of attention lately is this component of shelter and how that might have an outsized impact on inflation measures in the future. At the same time, while we're trying to figure out whether we are at that peak or not. Jeff, can you talk about why shelter is important as it relates to measuring inflation?
Sure. So it's important because it takes up so much of the market basket. But you're right. It also, prices are somewhat slower to change in shelter. So we're not talking about buying houses because that's it's considered an investment. So we're talking about renting, or if you do own the equivalent of if you had rented that property. So we're looking a lot at leases. Leases don't change every month for an individual renter. They usually or often change yearly. And so we ask questions to help us understand exactly what's happened. We look at a unit and we look to see, okay, if there was a change, was it a renewal of a lease or is it a new tenant? There's a lot of studies that show that if it's just a renewal, it might go up a little bit. If it's a completely new tenant, it will go up a lot more. So as a result of that, it does take longer for changes in shelter pricing to show up in the CPI. And I would expect that we would probably continue to see that portion of the CPI going up for a while because of recent changes in leases. It'll take a while to be reflected.
So
can I just jump in really quick here?
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. I just wanted to ask Jeff, because this is something I've wondered, and we talk about it a lot in this current inflation cycle, about those changes in shelter prices, right? And I think you touched on a little bit, but I'm super curious in why that lag takes as long as it does. Just in terms of what you were saying about the new leases versus older leases and, owner equivalent rent and things like that. Why is that log in existence? And is there any way as a reporter to, kind of cleanly point that out in a way that explains it to a reader in, like a quick way?
So statistical surveys are complex. And so unfortunately, it's a little bit hard to explain that very easily to folks. We do have a lot of information on our website that a reporter could use to try to distill it into a shorter soundbite for folks. But very briefly, I'll just say that our housing survey, our sample is divided into 6 pieces. And, we'll do one piece in January, the next piece in February, et cetera, until we get to June. And then we start in July with the January piece again. So we can't visit all those properties every single month to talk to either the landlords or the renters. So that's kind of explains the lag.
And I'll just say something here that maybe you wouldn't be inclined to say, Jeff, and that is, we've had the opportunity at Cebu going back to a couple of years before the pandemic of partnering with NABE, which is a major economists group, and having individuals from your agency and the other statistical agencies to speak to journalists and others and economists. And one thing that's been a constant theme, both among all the stakeholders there, as far as I can tell, is that statistical agencies don't always get the funding they want or need to improve their process, much the same as, ironically, many elected officials don't want to fund the only agency, the federal government, that collects revenue, so that they're forced to use Apollo space capsule era computer technology to process revenue. So that's another aspect of both financial and civic literacy that doesn't necessarily get advertised out beyond the Beltway. One of the questions sort of plays upon one of the themes we already touched on, but maybe takes it another step, and that is, how do we know when to change the inflation story around, switching things up? And the specific phraseology was, how do we progress the story as local journalists without basically being formulaic? Anybody want to take that one? Any ideas? When does the narrative need to change? When the data changes, Dion?
Yeah, I would say when the data changes. I think this most recent CPI print was a great example of the narrative really changing. When we got that CPI print for the last month, it showed that inflation really had not peaked in March, as the Fed had projected, as a lot of economists had projected, and as a lot of us had written. And that really completely changed the narrative. I think, though, that as journalists, we need to get out ahead of that and talk about the ways the narrative could change. I think it can be scary, especially for a lot of editors, to kind of step out on that limb and talk about that, because especially when we're talking about things that haven't happened previously. I know there is a bias to assume that the way things have been is the way they will always be. And I think a lot of times as journalists, we need to ask the question, well, what if they're not? And really explore that a lot more. And that gets us, I think, out of that, that kind of plateau that I think this person is asking about, and allows us to kind of think in different ways. But it's difficult because you're asking tough questions, and you don't want to be an alarmist. You don't want to, yell fire in a crowded building, right? But you also, I think, do importantly, in order to have these bigger and more forward-thinking conversations, ask what happens if the narrative isn't the same, if things aren't as they've always been.
Jonnelle, I'm going to put a different twist on that question, because as one who previously worked in so-called daily journalism for many years, and more in broadcast than anything else, there's very often the dynamic where the editor thinks the story's something, and you might agree with that. You might know it to be different, and you might want to actually try to change that narrative even in the newsroom. And you work for an organization that's obviously derives a big part of its revenue from the financial sector. So, people are going to be on the edge of their seat, so to speak, looking for these changes and trends for an investable opportunity. So how do you manage that process, at least in the real world newsroom or the virtual newsrooms that we're all operating in these days?
So I think one big lesson, especially of the past few years, is that things that we think are going to happen don't always happen. And if that could relate to what's going to happen with inflation, or, previously we were looking a lot at the fiscal aid as it was fading, how that would affect people, what choices they would have to make, or that it would even fall off, and then we kept getting more support, or we didn't see people behaving the way that they that people expected them to, right? Like spending has stayed strong, savings are still elevated, although they are declining. And even now, with prices being elevated, people are still spending. So we really don't know how people are going to react. So I think like I'm checking my own preconceptions constantly and reminding myself to look at, well, what do we see in the data, and letting that sort of drive, keeping my curiosity, keeping my perspective in mind, and continuing to worry or think about the same, kind of things that I am inclined to think about, but remembering that nobody knows what's going to happen, and so reminding myself of that, to stay humble, and also making sure with the editors if there's something that they want me to look into, that I do look into it, and then report back honestly about what I find.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to remind our audience that we'll be wrapping this up at the top of the hour, which means we have about a third of our time left. So for our participants, our panelists, we may try to move a little more quickly with our answers here so we can take more. One of the questioners, in terms of trying to anticipate how the story's changing or how it may change, is this often bandied about notion of stagflation. Jeff, is there an economic definition of stagflation, or is that more of a prosaic approach that people take to that concept?
I think it's a little bit of both, probably. We definitely have the inflation part. Are we having the productivity losses? We'll really see what happens next year.
And would you require essentially very low output or GDP for that to happen? Obviously, if you had a recession, that would be different.
Right. I probably we would need low output, but I think it's going to be more about the duration of that will be the thing to really look at, my opinion.
Another hot topic I get asked about it a lot as well is this notion of recession. Obviously, the risks for that have risen. Chairman Powell talked about it here over the past couple of days as well. To Dion's point about not trying to yell fire in a crowded theater, but if there's actually a fire in there, you probably should call attention to it. What are our thoughts about, first of all, the self-styled group, which defines recessions, there's a huge lag there. So, should we be attentive to this happening sooner rather than later, or what are our thoughts about that? I'll go to you, Jonnelle, because that's obviously a Fed-related story when Chairman Powell is talking about those risks with the shift in monetary policy as well.
So I feel like we keep repeating ourselves, but it really does come down to what we see in the economic data. So, like you said, a recession is not officially named until after the fact a lot of the time. So we would then maybe just take a look at, well, what are the ways in which this would show up, right? So spending, investing, there's been a lot of talk now about job openings, and we've seen that just yesterday, I think it was, or earlier this week, that Indeed showed that job postings are starting to come down a little bit. So, I think just sort of looking for fresh ways to quantify what is happening out there in the real economy, even if we don't have the GDP numbers yet to show that. So constantly, I welcome anyone's suggestion as well. And it comes back to that same, the previous question you had about stagflation. Are we encountering that? I would say probably right now the answer is no, because we have job growth, we still have spending, we still have economic growth. But people are curious about, I guess one way we've tried to write about it is just looking at, okay, well, we don't know how things are going to play out, but here are the possible things that could be potentially adding to inflation that may not respond to interest rate increases, for example. So that's sort of one way to slice it out, or look at the longer term pressures that could add to inflation over time. But yeah, it all comes down to the numbers, and at least maybe trying to find a creative way to pull out one component of that. And looking at alternative data resources if some of the government data might not be as responsive as you like. Like there's all sorts of like weekly indicators that we've all become much more familiar with during the pandemic.
Yeah. It would be hard to imagine that a recession has begun when you have roughly 200,000 plus new claims for unemployment benefits, right? In a given week. Anything to add there, Dion?
I would just add that I do think it's entirely possible that we're at least in a technical recession right now. I mean, we'll find out when GDP is released. I think that's just July 28th or 29th, what the Q2 GDP is. But I really think, again, I always try to err, because I work and have generally worked at publications that err on the side of not being alarmist. Like they'd rather we be too cold than too hot. And so I try to, as a reporter, err on the side of, well, maybe it is hot. And, I think also we obviously as journalists have to be conscious of being on the other side of that. When there are certain publications where I've worked and where friends of mine have worked, where the emphasis, or they choose to err on the side of, let's get, hot clickbait headlines, right? And let's write alarmist stories. And I think then it's your responsibility to be on the other side. But I do think right now we're in this place where it is not all that unlikely, given the data that we've seen, and we are currently in a recession, that it is not all that unlikely that we could be seeing stagflation in the future. And so let's dig into that. Let's ask those questions. Let's look for that data that supports that, or tells us that that's incorrect. I think the best conversations I have with the sources, the economists, the data producers that I talk to, are when I have an idea and they're like, no, Dion, that's stupid. You're being ridiculous. Here's why. And it's like, oh, okay, well, that idea was ridiculous, but you said this. Let's dig into that. So I think it's really great, and the way some of the best stories I've written have come about is because I see something and I get this crazy idea that, like, whoa, wait, are we going to 11 right now? And then I'll call some sources and I'll be like, hey, look at this data point here. Like, I think that says we're going to 11. And they say, no, you're crazy. We're still at 4. Here's why. But I think a lot of times journalists don't want to bring those stories either to their editors or to their sources, because we're kind of afraid of seeming alarmist or seeming crazy. And I think we need to do more of that. So I would push for folks to do more of that in terms of the initial conversations you have with your editors, the initial conversations that you have with your sources, and people who will steer you in the right direction, right? Who aren't just gonna be like, oh yeah, you're right, that's crazy. I think if you've got good sources, smart people who look at the data, who are going to really be, have their heads in the numbers, they're going to tell you if you're right or wrong, and they're going to help steer you in the direction of a new and original and interesting idea.
And one thought I had about that over the last few weeks is, for many Americans, and this is about the constant effort to try to associate ourselves with what we might regard as regular or real people, not journalists or so-called experts, is that for many Americans, the question of a recession at some level may at this point be irrelevant, because the difficulties they're having uniquely associated with inflation can be much more challenging than the sharp and shallow recession that we had in early 2020. Think about the fact that the official unemployment rate was 14.7%. Well, what's the percentage of the population that is struggling because of inflation? I mean, it's a bit of a rhetorical question, but just to think about the problems and dynamics that are associated with those two different things are in some ways different and in some ways similar. There's another part of this story which we may not be giving enough attention to broadly here at home, and that is the international aspect of inflation, where it's much worse outside the United States in many countries such as Turkey and across Europe. Jeff, any thoughts about that? I know you're not necessarily looking to measure that, but obviously when Chairman Powell is saying, essentially components of food or energy are priced globally, it's impossible to get away from that concept, isn't it?
Well, that's right. And, we do talk with some of our counterparts at other at the statistical agencies of other countries. So we have a sense of what's going on. Again, looking at our import price index, we know that imports coming to this country, we're paying more for those. But look at our export price index. That's up in some ways even more. And that means people in other countries are paying a lot more for goods that we produce here and send abroad. So this is something that's happening globally right now.
Yeah. Deglobalization has not fully occurred, has it? Despite all of the talk around that. Should we be doing a better job of covering that, Jonnelle and Dion, if for no other reason to talk about how all those dots are connected, but also we're all citizens of the same planet?
I feel like we've seen some stories about that in terms of, especially for the longer term, right? How if we are having this moment where there's a little bit of deglobalization, that how that could affect inflationary forces in the long run. I think people are starting to write about that and think about that. It all comes back to, though, we don't know exactly how it's all going to play out. But it's, we faced so many unknowns in the last few years, and I think we have to remember we don't know how everything's gonna settle down in the future.
Yeah, we may not know how anything is going to settle down in the future. Dion?
No, I definitely think that we do. I agree with you, Mark. I think I recently did a story about the appreciation of the Russian ruble. It's been one of the strongest currencies in the world this year. And I remember my editor kind of being like, okay, but like, why does someone in Kansas care? Why do regular people care? And the answer to that was, well, the strengthening Russian ruble means Russia has a bit more cover to continue its war with Ukraine. A continued and protracted war with Ukraine continues to put upward pressure on wheat prices, upward pressure on fuel prices. That's going to put upward pressure on food, gasoline, and also just about everything else, because as we know, just about everything we get is transported by some vessel that uses some form of oil. So that's a story that's going to affect someone in Kansas, someone in Ohio, regular people all over the US. And so it was taking that story, okay, here's this thing about the Russian ruble, and making that direct point. And I think there are a lot of ways that we can do that, and ways to really take these global stories and make them local, or at least make them apply to, your average everyday Joe Six-Pack American.
Yeah, and civil instability will get your attention in a minute when those things happen. We have a question here. Seth is asking, and I know your former colleague, Jonnelle, Michelle Singletary, did a take on this about a week or two ago about focusing on solutions for sort of actionable information, whether it's for consumers, et cetera. I know maybe at Bloomberg you're not as focused on that, but any thoughts about how people can do that and even look to localize those kind of approaches?
So I think it's really important, and we do have people at Bloomberg who cover from that perspective. And I myself, for many years, I used to work with Michelle, like you said, covered personal finance. And I think that perspective is really helpful, because when something big happens, I still think, okay, well, how does this affect workers? How does this affect people who are buying groceries or whatever it might be, saving for retirement, saving for the next layoff, or whatever it is. So yeah, we definitely need to be writing about that. And I think it's always difficult to find a fresh way to get into it. And I mean, one of the things I try to do in this role is as well highlight the policies that make it maybe that brought us to this point, and the policies that could address whatever it is that I'm writing about. And I ask that of people, is okay, so we go over this challenge, this disparity, this trend, and then it's like, okay, well, what are the solutions that are being discussed? What are the ones that are more likely to become a reality? And what are the ones that need to be discussed that are not in the conversation right now? So even if I'm not writing a how-to guide, I do try to bring in that part of it in terms of what could be done or what's possibly being done.
Mm-hmm. Dion?
Yeah, I would just say it's, depending on what you do, finding that local angle is always very important because, again, it gets to the whole reason why we do this thing, right? Like we're trying to inform people about the world and how that relates to them. And if you can't find that connection, it's important to go out and get it, I think. So yeah, no, I think in terms of solutions oriented stories, those have been certainly difficult because inflation is just this broad force, right? It's just kind of everything and everywhere. And, you've got the president saying he's doing everything he can. It's priority number one. You've got the chairman of the Fed saying it's priority number one. They're doing everything they can. So it's just kind of a matter of keeping in mind and framing for your audience, here's what this is and here's why it's happening here, 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 and here, because there are answers. You just kind of have to go out and find them.
Yeah, and today's headline story, left-hand column in the Washington Post was sort of pretty straightforward about how the president's call for eliminating the federal gasoline tax was literally a solution that would amount to a drop in the bucket. So it's not only the solutions that are viable, but perhaps the ones that are discussed but not. We just have a few minutes before we need to close, so this might be a good opportunity for just a brief closing thought for each of you. And along with that, and we'll start with you, Jeff, obviously we have a pretty good idea about where the story has led us to this date, which includes, that wake-up call or the wake-up calls with inflation expectations and measurement of inflation. What should people be watching in the intermediate and longer terms as the story and these variety of stories evolve, Jeff, and just your final closing thoughts?
Sure. I would just say, watch for the next data release. CPI is out June 13th, July 13th, PPI July 14th, imports and exports July 15th. Just important to keep looking at these data. I think that there's an interesting phenomenon related to inflation. Economists, we like to think that we know how people will react in certain situations. I think all bets are off right now with inflation because we have not had it for so long. Sure, occasionally we've had gas prices go up and then they go back down. The people under 50 really have not experienced inflation in their lifetimes, not serious like this. People 50 to 60 maybe remember it. Maybe they remember their parents complaining about gas prices or something, but they weren't spending their own money on things such that they had to pay rent or anything or buy food. So you're really looking at a small percentage of the population that are really remembering what inflation means. And so I don't think we can really predict how people are going to react to this. And, encouraging people like your PIN did to whip inflation now back in the 70s, that's a whole new concept. And we're not doing that yet.
And that didn't work, by the way. I just want to point that out. Jonnelle, I'll go to you. Final closing thought, and what should people be watching?
So just want to thank everybody again for having us on this panel. Really good conversation. At least what I will be watching, well, again, like Jeff said, what does the data show? Because that's what the Fed is watching and what they'll be using to make their decisions. But also I'll be looking at, what's going on in the labor market as we see higher rates and in the housing market. So the monthly jobs report, as well as what happens with sales and if home prices start to go up more slowly and even come down, and where in the country do we really start to see that hit the most?
Yeah, well said. And I just add to that the monthly job openings from the Labor Department, the so-called JOLTS report, because Chairman Powell has basically said there are too many of those right now relative to the perception of qualified candidates, as well as the official number of unemployed. Dion?
Yeah, well, you stepped all over mine, Mark. I was going to talk about the JOLTS report. I love the JOLTS report.
Well, you can accentuate it,
I will accentuate, yes. I love the JOLTS report. Some of the less followed reports, I think, are really providing a lot of value these days. Jeff mentioned PPI, the Producer Price Index. That's one that's been kind of, I think, leading CPI, and one I've been watching for a little while. That JOLTS report, the Challenger layoffs reports, that one's been really, I think, interesting in terms of really framing the labor market. It's not a one that gets a lot of attention, but I think that one's very important. Also, the Fed's G19 Consumer Credit Report. I've been watching that one pretty closely. Those are some reports that I don't think get as much media attention as they deserve, and I think particularly in the environment right now that we're in, are very interesting. Also, real-time data, if you can get a lot of those, there are, opentable.com. There are people who track those for restaurant reopenings, things like that. So there's a lot of real-time data indicators that can be really useful right now. And I just say, yeah, try to find and follow as many of those and see what you can put together, because there's definitely a lot of interesting things and unprecedented things going on.
Yeah, for better and for worse, you all are in the eye of this hurricane because you're the experts that people are turning to explain this. So thanks to our rock star panelists. We really appreciate it. And thanks to Cebu and my colleague Matt of the Cebu board for bringing us all together. And I'm certainly happy to try to answer questions via email. And I know Jeff put his contact information for his colleagues, he and his colleagues out there as well. So thanks to all you for dialing in today. Stay safe and keep up the great work. So take care. Thank you.